Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1, action.
Assume nothing.
Brash, bald-faced blasphemy.
Question everything.
I find it extremely hard to imagine.
Open your eyes.
It is quite all right to be an atheist.
The fastest growing group of people in the country has been measured as being those who have no belief or who are atheists.
You don't have to be apologetic or quiet about it.
Challenge the opposition.
You see religion on 100 fronts losing the argument.
And start thinking. This is the Thinking Atheist Worldwide.
Tonight, our topic of conversation is atheism and sexuality. I'll just tell you right off the bat that this is probably going to be some pretty intense discussion on some very intense topics. And so if that, if you're listening with young children, you may want to take that into consideration. This may not be the show for you. Now, we've covered the issue of sexuality as it relates to religion in the past, and we'll do some of that tonight. But I also wanted to attack it from a different angle. I wanted to broaden the umbrella so that we're talking about the larger issues of sexuality in general. Sexuality that doesn't exist inside the biblical cookie cutter. And so we're going to take your calls on this show. I've got Dr. Darrel Ray coming up. I've got Zinnia Jones. I've got Greta Christina. And just confirmed that Jen Peoples from the Atheist Experience TV show is going to be joining us during the podcast as well. So we'll do that. I've got a lot of emails, and a lot of the emails had specifically to do with the experiences of people who are gay and who have come out as gay, and they parallel it to what it was like coming out as an atheist. They talk about, in many cases, it was even harder being the atheist, which is pretty amazing. Let's start by reading an email, shall we? And I'm going to substitute some different names for the real names for some of the more sensitive emails I got in. I really felt like even if they didn't ask for it, I might protect the anonymity, the identity of the people who are sending me these very, very personal stories. This I'll call Susan. She says, I'm an atheist, but was very religious for the first 33 years of my life. My parents were Southern Baptist, and as a teenager became Pentecostal. I was very devout. I attended church as many times a week as possible. My parents never really talked about sex. When it was mentioned, it was called the nasty. They were raised to believe you shouldn't have sex before marriage. In fact, any sexual activity at all was wrong. I had never masturbated. I didn't know how to. I feared my father, and I never tried. After I was about 17, I'd been dating the same guy for about 2.5 years. My parents found a note that dropped out of my purse that described an oral sex encounter that we had had together. They were infuriated. They said that God saw that as the same thing as sex. I lived in a heap of guilt. I feared that God would reveal to them if I did it anymore, and they would punish me. Dad always said I was never too big to spank. That wasn't a healthy way to live. The baggage of my childhood upbringing affected my later marriage to someone else. For many years, I thought oral sex was wrong and never did it, probably for at least 5 years. Pleasuring and being pleasured felt sinful. My husband and I went through our journey to atheism together. Religion had held me in shackles for most of my life. Now I am free to express myself sexually and fully give myself to another without guilt or shame. Sex is such a large part of life. I can finally enjoy it. Susan, thank you so much for the letter. 704, you're on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast, and you're kicking off the switchboard. Who's this?
This is Jasmine.
Jasmine, I'm so glad you called. Start me off. What do you think?
Well, let me just first get started by saying I live in the South, so if that...
So nobody in the South has sex, or what are you trying to tell me here, Jasmine?
It's just that certain aspects of sex are somewhat repressed. And, I have friends who are gay or bisexual or whatever, and they're afraid to tell their families because their families are so religious. I live in North Carolina where, people are concerned with, sex before marriage is sinful and everybody lets own as many guns as possible is pretty much where I live.
Yeah.
Now that I'm an atheist, I just think of sex and sexuality differently. Like before, I was afraid to even read like an erotic book, and now they're one of my favorite genres of books.
Just a nice way to kind of get away in your head, huh?
Yeah, it's a good escape.
All right. Well, Jasmine, I'm glad you called. I'm glad you're listening, and I appreciate you being a part of the show.
Thank you, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you very, very much. Take care, Jasmine.
All right, you too.
This was something that was part of my culture growing up. When they spoke about sexual desire, and let's just say it's framed with the word lust, right? To feel a desire, a passion or something, to have a desire to have sex. It was always framed that guys are the only ones who were like that. Guys were the only ones who operated from a position of desire, who wanted to satisfy sexual needs. And the women were always sort of responders, right? The man initiates and the woman then reciprocates. The man is the one who is on the prowl. The man is the one who is going out to satisfy his natural desire to have sex. Because he's a man, he thinks like a man. This is how they teach it, right? Some of them even sound that way. It never occurred to us, of course, as we are taught this, that women would naturally think, hey, this feels great. It was always the guy. It was always this male-driven, male-dominated thing. I know many families have taught sexual lessons in the sort of the cookie cutter of religion, and they framed it in the context of the Christian Bible. And I did speak about this in the first chapter of my book, where in the story of Adam and Eve, after Eve was tempted and succumbed to the temptation in the garden and ate the fruit, she had two major punishments, right? Outside of being exiled from the garden. One was that she would have sexual desire for her husband. It was actually part of her consequences, right? Your desire will be for your husband and he will rule over you. I think that's a direct quote from the scripture in Genesis. So now they've taken the woman and they have told her that her desire for a man, her sexual desire, is actually part of a punishment handed out by a male deity. The second part of it is the reason childbirth hurts so much is because a woman was cursed. Eve and her female descendants were all cursed after the mistake in the garden. Well, that's just tragic. I mean, you've predisposed all these young minds to expect sex to be tainted because of a mistake made thousands upon thousands of years ago. And if they feel a natural desire for someone else, well, it's part of the curse. It's part of what Eve did so long ago. You shouldn't be feeling this way. Or if you are, you at least have to carry the baggage that comes along with it. It's absolutely tragic. Heaven forbid that attraction might be to someone other than a man. Now we're really in hot water with the scriptures, and people really fight these identity issues all the time. I became a fan of my first guest almost as soon as I heard his name, as he dealt with some very, very difficult issues, especially when it comes to sex. And he wasn't this dry, droll, kind of a college professor sounding guy. He's this guy with a great sense of humor and a guy who loves people. And he travels all around the country and I think all around the world. He's written books, he's spoken on leadership and organizational development, but specifically he's been dealing with religion as it deals with sexuality. And he's written a very popular book called Sex and God. Dr. Darrel Ray, glad you made it. Thank you.
Great to be on again, Seth.
I tend to lean to you because, number one, I just love talking to you. You're always great on the radio, and you have such a sort of an everyman way of explaining and getting us into what are some very complex issues, some very touchy subjects. The issue of sex intrigues almost everyone, does it not? Everybody wants to talk about it, don't they?
Absolutely.
And we always talk about sex, it seems, in the church in this almost sacred cow kind of a way. You know, sex is the marital union. It is a man and a woman under the construct of biblical marriage. It is to be enjoyed this way. And outside of that, sexuality is a perversion. And you've seen a lot of this type of teaching, have you not?
Absolutely. And it's like the church tells you you can just have cheese and crackers for the rest of your life. Even though there's this enormous menu of things you could eat, the church says you can only have cheese and crackers. And they did the same things to sex. I'm just to use a metaphor, of course. There's so much about sexuality that's so much broader than anything any religion ever teaches. It's an effort to indoctrinate and control you. And my thesis is we should be attacking the sexuality issue much more than we're attacking these ideas around whether God exists or not.
People of our age bracket talk to our parents about sexual subjects or sexual issues inside and outside of the church. And I look at many of these so-called conservative social boundaries of, say, the 50s, right, before the sexual liberation of the 60s. And we see some of that is still imprinted on much of our parents' generation. They don't want to talk about sex. They had a difficult time communicating about sexual issues. They never had the talk.
Right.
It's dirty. Even when they don't say it out loud, every piece of body language sort of communicates, we don't want to talk about it. It's filthy. Do you catch that with much of our parents' generation?
Oh, absolutely. Unfortunately, I think that generation has been influential on imprinting it on our generation as well. Here in Kansas City, we have this organization called IHOP, and I don't mean the pancake group, International House of Prayer. You try to talk to someone, and there's thousands of kids that were here last week in Kansas City praying for homosexuality to go away and things like that. You try to talk to some of those kids about sex, and they simply can't. They don't know how to talk about it, except in terms of Jesus this or God that. So it's being imprinted, unfortunately, it's being imprinted on the current generation within the religious community. But yeah, I clearly those people in the previous generations, especially coming up 30s, 40s, 50s, were really programmed. What happened when you got birth control, that changed the equation totally. And I think our culture still, we can see by the last election, our culture's still coming to grips with what it means to have birth control for women in terms of their political power, their liberation, their sexual power, their ability to express themselves sexually. And our culture still hasn't come to a final conclusion on that.
I'm amazed at how if a woman takes charge of her life and decides that she's going to make whatever decision she wants and enjoy sex and whatever relationship she wishes, she is held to a different standard, and that still happens constantly.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, and that is the patriarchal society. Even if you've been a lifelong atheist, you're still living in this society. It's very patriarchal, still gives women messages about ownership and behavior. I mean, all that stuff we look at Saudi Arabia in horror that women have to dress up like they do, cover every part of their body and such. But look what we're doing in the United States. We oftentimes see people being criticized for simply dressing provocatively, so-called provocatively. Women have a right to dress however they want. Men have a right to dress however they want. But somehow it's the women that get the condemnation in this culture about it. You can hardly look at an article in a magazine that doesn't criticize a woman for some part of her physical appearance. And it's just stupid. It's horrendous.
Are we men are we that easily led? I mean, I know we're visually stimulated. There's a visual attraction that is part of how we are hardwired. So we see a woman who is dressed provocatively, we look.
Seth, I never look at women. I've
got this on a recording, Darrel. Well, and I feel weird saying it out loud. I mean, it's not like I'm ogling, I'm disrespecting, but if you see a beautiful woman and you are a heterosexual male and that woman is provocatively dressed, it just seems like it's a reflex. And then they say, oh, God, you're just a typical guy.
You are a typical guy. I'm a typical guy. Yeah. Heck, if you see the research, there's really interesting research around this. If a good-looking woman, well-endowed, walks into the room, women will look at her as much as men look at her. In fact, the research shows that women oftentimes will look more and more closely at that woman as she enters the room than men will.
Now, are they looking from an analytical point of view, or is it an attraction of some kind?
Probably, we're not positive, but it looks like it probably is more a competitive aspect. Did a competitor just walk in the room that could take my man from me, kind of a thing. But women are read the women's magazines. They are they're paying a heck of a lot of attention to other women. Women pay a lot of attention to other women. Women pay more attention to each other oftentimes than they pay to any man. So it's kind of a myth that men are the only ones looking, because women are looking too, a hell of a lot. I don't know if you've ever been involved with a woman who's really open and sexually very open. And I had several girlfriends over the years who were. And we're walking down the street and she'll elbow me and say, that guy is hot. Now, if you can get a woman to be that open with you, you'll realize just how much they're looking. I even had a girlfriend, we had a contest to see if I could. I'm not sure. I had a contest to see, this went on for like 6 months, to see if I could judge who she thought was hot. And I was wrong more than right.
Really?
I was shocked. Yeah, I couldn't guess who she thought was hot. And that bugged the daylights out of me because obviously she thought I was hot enough to, to date.
Honestly, why would men be held to a different standard when it comes to the rules of attraction? Why are women not allowed to be attracted and to express what they consider attractive? Why in the world is it so one-sided? And I guess it speaks again to the patriarchal society that we live in. So people then, let's say they walk away from religion and now they're like me, they're living a deity-free life. In your opinion, are they still constrained by many of those predispositions to think in religious ways about sex?
Well, that's the whole reason I wrote Sex and God, because I have seen, as I've interacted with atheists literally all over the planet, I mean, I've spoken everywhere, I'm amazed at how many atheists still are governed by what are functionally religious ideas. For example, I've had so many men say, I'm uncomfortable having sex with my wife, girlfriend during menstruation. I'm saying, okay, where'd you get that idea? Because women are oftentimes more horny during menstruation than any other time of the month. I mean, that's when you can have some of the best sex, the most fun sex with some women. And they can't tell you where they got that idea, except, well, grandma told me it was dirty. Well, where'd grandma get the idea it was dirty? Because in the Bible, it says you can't touch a woman for 7 days if she's on her period. It says that right in the Old Testament. And many people still believe this crap. I met a guy, an atheist. All his life he's been an atheist. He came up to me after seeing one of my talks and said, I had no idea how much guilt I still had around masturbating until I heard you talk tonight. As you know, I start many of my talks off with the question, do you masturbate? And I ask everybody to raise their hand that does. And large numbers raise their hand, including myself. So
it's a touchy subject, if you'll pardon the expression, but are people more inclined these days to be honest about what they do and do not enjoy sexually?
Well, I think atheists are moving in that direction. I think free thinkers, I think secular people are, but they're still nowhere near where they need to be. I mean, you trying to talk openly about human sexuality still gets the hackles up of large numbers of people in our community. And I'm not going to say it's not nearly as big. If I went to a free thought group and I said, how many of you masturbate? And had people raise their hand, a lot of people would raise their hand, and a few people would just keep their hand down, even though they do it. But if I went to a Baptist church and asked that question, not one hand would go up, even though all of them know they're doing it. So right there is evidence of progress, if you will. But what I've also noticed is the older people, the older generation, kind of going back to your other question, they're the ones who do not raise their hand. And I know darn good and well, I mean, people have some kind of sex. I mean, your best sex partner in life is yourself. Even if you don't have a partner, you still have you. So people who say they're not in any way having autosexual experiences are probably either very sexually frustrated, or they're lying. In most cases. I'm not going to say that's always true because there's medical reasons and other things. But why would you deny yourself pleasure? And I see atheists, I see secularists just not yet quite coming to grips with some of these issues. For example, the idea of when you can have sex and what kinds of sex you can have are still governed, I think, oftentimes by your childhood training.
So what are we talking about? I mean, they say that the missionary position is God's ordained template for sex. You're looking each other in the eye, and it's almost a spiritual thing, right? They say that sex is not just a physical union in the church. It is actually a spiritual union. And so if someone says, well, I like it this way, or I like it that way, or I want to hang from the chandelier, or I want to dress up as Catwoman or whatever, then they're told, hey, wait a minute, now you've screwed up God's perfect plan. I mean, that's a real problem.
Yeah, and if I step outside of this narrow boundary that religion has defined, even if I'm an atheist, and I say, I really would like some oral sex, or would like to give oral sex, or I would like to try tying you up or you tying me up. The minute you step out, I have so many atheists say, I could never tell my wife that. I could never talk to my husband about that. And I ask him, well, why couldn't you? What's stopping you? And I said, well, I just feel uncomfortable about telling my spouse. Now, wait a minute. the most important person in your life that you have the most intimate contact with, and you can't tell them something that you'd like to be tied up and spanked once in a while?
Well, you have to admit it'd be an odd conversation to have. Look, baby, tonight I was kind of thinking, I want my ass red before the night's over. Can you help me out with that, sugar? I mean, it's an odd conversation to have, but you're saying that it's a conversation that we shouldn't be embarrassed about. You just say it.
Absolutely. And if you cannot talk to your sex partner about would you say, tonight I'd like to have some pizza? Is that a problem? What's the problem with saying tonight? Let's go out to eat tonight. Well, that's all you're doing with sex is you're saying, instead of just having meat and potatoes at home tonight, let's go out. Let's go out on a date and go see a porn film or go check out a magazine.
Wow. Well, I mean, you'll forgive my extremely conservative upbringing just kicking in. And I must be a victim of the very same thing you're talking about, where I find myself going, oh, man, you can't do that. You can't say those things. You can't think those things. It's so opposite of what I've been trained for so many decades.
Absolutely right. But look at it rationally, Seth. What is the argument against being honest? Why would you even consider being dishonest about your thought processes with your spouse or your partner?
Seeing it from the perspective of simply being honest about your desires, about what you seek and what you crave in an intimate relationship with the person you love or the person you just happen to be spending the night with. It does seem to make sense when you look at it factually. Look, what do you like? What do you want? What rings your bell? Let's try that. Sex is for pleasure, yes?
It's for pleasure and for play. And I think that's the key. Actually, more than pleasure, sex is for play. And if two people can play together, they can do a lot of things. Imagine when you were a kid and you were playing with all your friends, and you would make up all sorts of shit, and you'd have the best time playing. Today we're going to be soldiers. Tomorrow they're going to play doctor and patient. The next day you're going to go out there and be a safari hunter or whatever, but you're playing. And that's what adults lose through religious training. We lose the ability to play. And probably the one place you can play the most in our adult life is sexually with your partner. And I'm so frustrated with how we continue to carry these ideas about what we can and can't, should and shouldn't. If you hear in your head the word should, oh, I shouldn't think about that, you have just hit a religious landmine. Because shouldshood, here's a famous saying, shouldshood leads to shithood. And if you are shoulding all over yourself, you're probably shoulding on your spouse as well.
All right, I've made some notes here. A soldier, doctor, an adventurer on safari. So I'm going to try to put that on my list here, just for the week. Just so I've got it written down. Any final closing thoughts before I move on to my next guest, Dr. Ray? What do you think?
I'm not here to tell your audience or you that all forms of sex are okay. I think there's clearly boundaries and limits around health, around consensuality, around age appropriate, and all that sort of stuff. But we need to examine ourselves and say, let's shed the last vestiges of religiosity, and that usually resides in sexuality. Your sexuality started the day you were born, started the day you were conceived. Every cell in your body is sexual. Religion starts indoctrinating you as soon as it possibly can. I watched my grandmother shove my brother's hand away from his penis when he was an infant, when he was on the table getting his diaper changed. That was my grandmother. That's a sexual lesson. I know my brother doesn't remember it because he was only 1 year old or less. So sexual programming begins before you even realize it is. That's why it's so insidious. That's why it's so difficult to overcome sometimes. And I think by bringing it to our consciousness, we can start challenging that stuff. And I hope your audience will take a look at Sex and God, because I want to challenge people.
Dr. Darrel Ray, author of the book Sex and God, How Religion Distorts Sexuality. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it on his website. I know you have a Facebook page. I am a big fan, Darrel. I'm a big fan. And I thank you so much for taking a few minutes with us on this episode. And I'll find an excuse to bring you back here in the next few months, I'm sure. Okay.
Fun talking to you. And say hi to Greta for me, and I'm glad to see she's feeling better.
You got it. You got it. Happy New Year, my friend.
All right. Bye-bye. You too.
I've got Zinnia Jones and Greta Christina coming up here in the next few minutes. But first, 765, you're on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast. Who's this?
Joseph.
Joseph, thank you so much for calling. What's going on?
My wife and I have been married for 5 years now, and we were Christians when we first got married. We came away from that and became more or less agnostic within the past couple of years. Well, a year from now, we decided to start attending swing clubs.
Tell me about that. I mean, I'm curious about the culture. I mean, swingers are what? Were you that way from the beginning, or is it just that the magic is gone and we're trying to rekindle something? Let's be dangerous. What drives that?
Well, it has nothing to do with the magic being gone. It's just more or less just having fun with it. We believe that sex is a like a pastime, like recreation, and of course we always practice safe sex. And for the most part, we're completely normal people. I mean, we go to work, we take care of kids, but every once in a while, maybe every couple months or so, we'll get a babysitter and we'll go to a swing club and just me and her and have a fun time.
So you leave with your wife. Do you come back with someone else?
Oh, no. The swing club is set up to where it's the place where you can swap partners and whatnot. You can do same room or separate room, but no, we always come back with our own.
So do you talk about it with each other? Hey, this is what it was like. This is what happened, or is it your own private thing?
Yeah, of course. See, I think the most fun part about it is at the afterwards, because like our sex with each other is just crazy, like for the next week or so, and of course we talk about it a lot.
Is there an element of making each other jealous? The idea that she's with someone else to a degree makes you want to be better the next time around, makes you want to... Does that play into it, even in a playful way?
That was kind of an issue at the beginning. Like, it's something that you have to kind of overcome because it's kind of been ingrained into our culture. But we try to get past that, and we try to realize we love each other and we want to be with each other, and we have a history, like we've been through all this together, and we've changed so much together, and that's not something that you can replace with just one night of sex with another person.
So do you tell anybody in your circle? Does anybody else know who knows you? Do they know this about you, or do you have to hide it from the world?
Absolutely not. Yeah, that would be completely... I have a couple of people at work that know that are more open-minded, but other than that, it's completely secret.
Are you in a conservative part of the United States, I'm guessing?
Yeah, we live in Indiana, and we live in a part of Indiana that's real conservative, so...
I know nothing about that culture, so to hear you talk about it, I hope I didn't sort of step over any boundaries by asking what it was sort of like.
No,
I mean, to me, I think to myself, if you look and you see your wife and she is with someone else, even just holding someone else, arm in arm, hand in hand, they're dancing, they're doing whatever, even before the sex comes into play, I would think that your first reaction would be, get away from my wife, What are you doing over there?
Believe it or not, that's actually a turn on.
Really? So you feel a sense of possession.
Another thing I wanted to talk about was Darrel Ray you and Darrel Ray were talking about how females tend to look when there's an attractive woman. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit because I've noticed that, well, my wife is straight, but I've noticed that in the swinging community, it's very, very common for there to be bi females. It's almost like 50-50. I mean, almost half of the women in the swinging community are bi, and I wonder if that's a very common thing among women, and maybe most women in more conservative cultures don't acknowledge that because it's repressed.
Natalie and I can be walking down the street, and a hot gal in a short skirt walks by, and Natalie will be the first one to say, hey, geez, I mean, it's not like she doesn't notice, wow, there's a beautiful woman, whether it's attraction or whether, I think it's just like, holy geez, look at that. I don't see that I don't think she's attracted to women. I don't think so, but now you got me thinking about it. But, it's not like I don't know that she's threatened by it. I think she's like, hey, dude, check her out. It's one of those things. And I might do the same. I'll see it. Look at that guy over there. Jeez, he looks like freaking Hugh Jackman, check him out. So I hope I didn't come off wrong when I say that guys are always looking at pretty girls. I know that people tend to look at each other. So
Yeah, I understood that.
Well, thanks for sharing your perspective. It opens up a whole new world, my friend, and I wish you and your squeeze the very best.
No problem.
All right, take it easy.
Thank you.
I had another email in from, and I will call this person A. Said, I noticed the next podcast is about sexuality and religion, and I wanted to give you my input. I imagine a lot of your listeners who are not heterosexual are either homosexual or bisexual or somewhere in between, perhaps pansexual as well. I myself am still only 16, but I've spent a lot of time learning about different sexualities since I was having a hard time pinpointing my own for quite some time. I did eventually realize I am in fact asexual, aromantic. With the Bible's stances on reproduction and sex, I stand in a weird place to the religious where I don't experience those, quote, awful feelings of lust, but I also won't go on to get married and have children. Because of simple ignorance, a number of people react by denying that a person can even be asexual and deny a part of who I am in the process. So while more well-known sexualities are out there and looked down upon, mine is often denied entirely. A continues. For some background, I'm not sure how much you know about sexuality, but sexuality is sometimes split into two parts to describe romantic and sexual attraction. People can be, for example, heterosexual, but also be bi-romantic, where the person can be attracted to people of the male and female genders romantically, while not being sexually attracted to their same gender. There's a lot that goes into sexuality and the many possible sexualities. I'm actually fortunate to be asexual, aromantic, because it means I don't have to make up labels to try to explain what genders I would be attracted to. Not only am I an asexual, aromantic atheist, I'm also agender. By the way, those are labels. That means I have no gender. I identify as neither male nor female nor anything else. Agender people sometimes have a hard time explaining their sexuality since there is no, quote, opposite gender. Gender's pretty big a topic too. So I'm not sure you even want to touch on that at all, but I think it would be very nice for you to mention since trans people are usually lumped into the LGBT crowd. Thank you very much for the letter. I've got Zinnia Jones, my next guest. Zinnia is an atheist activist, a writer, a video blogger. Zinnia's video has been seen by like 7 million people at least, and is a big activist on the issues of belief and religion, atheism, political stuff, and LGBT rights. And Zinnia Jones joins me for tonight's podcast. Glad you're here.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Now, I was first introduced to you, it was like late 2009. You were a guest on the radio show in 2010, and you, to this day, continue to be an activist, continue to produce videos for your site and channel, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been active over the past year, and I continue to be producing videos, blogging on Free Thought blogs. Most recently, I even gave a speech at the Florida Secular Rally in November.
When you gave the speech, were you in lipstick and the whole shooting match or what?
Yeah, that's just how I present nowadays, so that's me.
Well, as we explore many of these topics, I find myself a little bit self-conscious because I come from 30 years inside conservative Christianity, only now in the last several years really beginning to see the issues of sexuality outside of that particular cookie cutter. If I ask the wrong question or ask the right question in the wrong way, please don't take offense. Okay, I'm just navigating my way.
I am completely willing. I'm completely willing to explain.
Understand that it comes really from a position of I really want to know. I really want to broaden my horizons. Why the lipstick and makeup? What drives that? Is it fulfilling to you to dress up as a woman? Is it a middle finger to the religious? Is it something else? What motivates that?
Well, it did just start out as sort of a kind of a striking style choice to sort of set myself apart. But now it's just, part of who I am. I am a woman. I present as a woman pretty much all the time. I don't really have a guy mode, so to speak. So
yeah, that's just what all that is.
You are an atheist. Do you identify as an atheist?
Yes, I am definitely an atheist.
Being an atheist, and is it gay, or how do I describe that for you?
You could say that I'm bisexual, and I am transgender too.
How do the issues that you have dealt with spiritually when it comes to rejecting God in a very, I'm guessing, a pretty conservative culture, yes?
Yeah. I mean, this is Florida, so yeah.
Well, I mean, Florida's got some pockets. I've spoken down in Florida, but I also know that you probably got you've got a lot of Bible thumping. You've also got the Church of Scientology down there. Geez, I can't imagine what that's like.
Yeah, down in Clearwater, yeah.
How have you been received? You didn't just announce I'm an atheist, but you have literally defied the very narrow confines for biblical sexuality in a relatively conservative state. What's that like?
Well, I can say for one thing, most people don't give me any trouble about it in everyday life. I mean, you project your confidence, you just go about your life, you act like everything is just completely normal, and people tend to follow suit with that. And at the same time, though, my partner and I, we do have to be careful about, like, say, how to find, friends and stuff, just people who will be cool with us, because that is something that's hard to find, unfortunately. People who are understanding, who are safe to be around, who won't, be a danger to us. So that can be somewhat limiting, but as to how we go about our lives and stuff, we don't really let that hem us in too much.
I'm guessing you have very strong opinions on biblical concepts about everything, including sexuality. You want to just sound off?
Yeah,
I mean,
say that. Yeah.
What is it that really cooks your noodle? What is it that makes you crazy when you look at the rules that are imposed on you by the religious around you?
Look, here we have people who are just using a book from just so many eras ago, from civilizations which faced various issues and so on, that simply do not apply to us anymore. I mean, there are already many areas in which we're not even willing to apply an 1800s morality, like keeping slaves, to our modern world. And yet they think we need to apply a morality of 500 BC or 33 AD to our modern world, and that everything from that era could somehow be, appropriately applied to modern times. It can't. These are absolutely very different things. I mean, most people wouldn't go so far as to say that we have the absolute answers to everything in the world now, and yet at the same time, people will turn around, turn to their religions, turn to their holy books, and say that, well, they must have had all the answers to everything all the way back then, and just conclude that we have to abide by that. And it is just such mental gymnastics, and it should be so obvious, the contortions they have to go through to pretend that this is something that we should abide by. I mean, their concepts of sex in particular are something that is so not applicable to modern times. I mean, yes, like in the Catholic Church, for example, they build up this whole theology of how sexual acts have to be not only uniting the people involved, but also has to have a possibility of procreation. Well, in modern times, so many people have non-procreative sex, and there is no particular reason why these things need to be coupled like that. And a lot of people who use contraception, they're people who already have kids, who don't need more kids. And to act like the morality of a sexual act depends on whether you're able to have babies from it, conceivably, that is just so far off base, and increasingly more and more people, even like within the Catholic Church, within Protestant churches, within all sorts of religions, their religions may say that from up high, but in their everyday lives, this is something that they understand is simply not applicable anymore, and they don't live that way. So it's really not hard to see why, a lot of this is irrelevant. And at the same time, people can look at their gay friends. So many people know gay people these days, bi people, trans people even, and they can see that how we live our lives is not something that's deserving of death or exile or going to hell or anything like that. When you know people personally and you understand them and you can respect them and be friends with them, it becomes a lot more difficult to say, hey, you deserve to be killed or be tortured forever, or what you're doing is a moral wrong and things like that.
Talking here with Zinnia Jones, I have a measure of shame because I come from that. I was raised to believe that homosexuality was an abomination as instructed by Yahweh. And of course, they told us that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and whatnot. And my own best friend came out as gay. And it was that moment that began my sort of realization that he hasn't changed. He's still the same amazing human being he was before I knew he was gay. And the problem really isn't him. The problem is me.
Well, let me tell you my experience with that. You shouldn't feel bad about that. I mean, a lot of children are raised in conservative religions or any other religions without having much of a choice in the matter. And, when we moved from a Catholic church to a more conservative Lutheran church, it was the Wells, Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod, we're talking hardcore, younger, creationist, Pope is the Antichrist nuttery, basically. And they taught, there was this one sermon I remember from our pastor that we're a church of the open door for anyone who wants to come in, but we're not a church of the wide door, he said. We're not okay with things like same-sex marriage and adultery and things like that. And they did preach against that. And at the time, still, I was young. I was pre-sexual. I didn't have a concept of what this meant in terms of what it implied in terms of intimate relationships of any sexuality and, what this actually meant for people, what such a connection would mean and how absolutely vile it is to condemn such a human connection wholesale like that. So at the time, I was just like, well, okay, they're saying this, so whatever. I always took it with a grain of salt, though, because not only did we have to sit in church every Sunday, I also had to go to catechism class, which was also taught by the pastor, where, at the same time we were learning things about how God put fossils in the ground to test our faith, and how radiometric dating is a conspiracy by scientists, because nothing can be older than 6,000 to 10,000 years, after all. And it always stuck out to me that, hey, this is just one Wednesday night for a couple hours where we go to church and listen to this guy. Rest of the week, I'm there in high school and, actual biology class, learning about evolution and actual facts. You can't just turn that off for like 2 hours and pretend you're in some kind of alternate reality where the world is completely different historically, physically, scientifically, everything like that. That just doesn't work. So I was absolutely aware that the preachers and so on and the doctrines and the religions and everything were fallible.
So you didn't go through the I'm broken, I'm damaged, I shouldn't be feeling this way, I shouldn't have these thoughts, I shouldn't do it. You didn't really go through that yourself.
No, I can't say that I did.
Okay, but can you speak to people who have, though? You've probably been witness to people who have racked themselves with guilt and shame and identity issues, and they probably went through years of, I shouldn't be feeling this type of attraction, as if it's the devil himself whispering in their ear. You've seen that firsthand, yeah?
Oh, absolutely. I hear from people all the time who took longer than I did to break out of religions which were telling them that who they are is wrong, that they are going to go to hell for this, that God hates them for who they are, that this could never be accepted, that it just means, a life of misery and dissatisfaction and disease and death and everything. And it really is terrible. People struggle with this for years, and these are people who are very devoted to their religions. These aren't atheists by any means. And, they're just struggling with this because of what they've been taught, and they believed it, but it was taught to them at such an early and pre-sexual age that they only later came to realize that all this condemnation, this was talking about who they are. And, what a terrible thing to realize and to struggle with that and to think that your eternal soul is in the balance here. That's an absolutely terrible thing to teach to anyone because, like you said, in Oklahoma, I'm sure you have a very large contingent of gay people, bi people, trans people. Being gay or bi or trans or otherwise queer, that occurs among every population, everywhere. There's nowhere where you don't have gay people. And since that occurs everywhere and pretty much inevitably and at a pretty steady rate throughout the population, to have societies, cultures, religious communities and things like that which are overtly hostile to people who are inevitably going to come to exist within those communities and who haven't done anything wrong, it really is a tragedy.
There are many parallels between coming out as an atheist and coming out as something other than a heterosexual. Have you seen that? I mean, there are almost identical roads. You're having to deal with what you've been predisposed to or indoctrinated with. You're having to deal with loved ones, family, friends, cultures, jobs, what have you. The parallels between coming out on both sides are pretty striking.
Yes, I even mentioned that in my speech at the rally in November, that there can be isolation, difficulty connecting to anyone else who feels that way, because you may not know there's anyone else who feels that way. You may think that these doubts or these questions about who you are, this questioning of your religious community and stuff, that's just a sin, that no one is supposed to do that. Personally, for me, it was never that difficult because, by the time there wasn't much atheist coming out to do. I mean, my family knows about it, but we had left church for a while by then. We all sort of just moved away from it without much struggle or anything. But still, coming out to my family, telling them that I'm actually a woman, that is one of the most terrifying things that you can come out to the ones who are close to you as.
May I ask, what was the reaction when you had this conversation? What was it like?
Well, I can say for one thing, my family they are very accepting, very supportive people. And I feel I was able to rely on that. And I knew it had to be done at some point. At the time that I came out to them, I'd already been living as a woman for more than a year. It's just that I'd also been, living in Florida with my partner and our children. So they hadn't been able to necessarily see everything that I had been going through. But when I reached the point that I was going to see a therapist about this, get started on, hormone therapy and everything like that, I felt that they at least deserved to be in the loop about what's going on in my life right now. And I do have to give them a lot of credit because a lot of people would have reacted much more poorly, but they were very, very understanding. That I just answered all their questions. They said, whatever makes me happy. And that did surprise me, and it shouldn't, because my family are decent people, but you can never really rely on anything for certain when you're coming out as transgender, that you're really a man or a woman, because that is something that a lot of people really do not know much about, that they have very terrible preconceptions about just due to the media, like, all the jokes about, that woman is actually a man in, comedy movies, or Jerry Springer and Maury shows and stuff like that.
Educate us then. What is a transgender person?
That would be a person who they were assigned a certain sex at birth, male or female, as we all are, but they prefer to live their lives as a sex other than that. If they were born male, they might prefer to live a life as female, or as a sort of mix between the two, or something that isn't within the binary like that.
Does it require surgery and hormone therapy and all that?
Well, some people define it as more of a broader umbrella that also includes things like, say, cross-dressing, people who aren't just totally feminine women or totally masculine men, or like metrosexuals, so to speak. But that is a very expansive definition that not so many people subscribe to. Transgender, in like the most common sense, means people who were assigned as one sex at birth, but go about their lives as another and prefer to identify that way. And that's how I identify. I've taken the female name. I just recently had my name changed. My relationship with my partner, she's a woman, and I'm a woman too. Our relationship it's a lesbian relationship. It's not a relationship between, a straight man and a straight woman. That's not the nature of it. Our kids don't have a mom and a dad. They have two moms. So it's a matter of who you are, which is far more comprehensive than just the clothes you put on.
You're a happy person, right? It's not like you're living in conflict every day and saying, oh, woe is me, I'm in violation of all the rules of nature. You actually found the skin you were comfortable in.
Yeah, and it's not something that's terrible for me or anything like that. I can honestly say that I'm happier than I've ever been. I mean, I started hormones a few months ago. Those have an incredible effect on your mood, how comfortable you are, and I have felt so much better since I've started living as a woman and identifying as a woman. I've gotten a heck of a lot more done in my life. I'm much more productive, for one. I've just been able to accomplish so much more. Things are pretty much better than they've ever been.
Does hormone therapy make you feel somewhat like a different person? I'm trying to understand what sensation comes after you have a hormone therapy treatment.
That is a super excellent question. In terms of the treatment, it can either be like injections or, patches or just pills that you take every day. So for me, it's just pills in the morning and pills at night. The experience is different for everyone, and you always have to talk to the individual. But for me, it's been not like being a different person or anything like that. And I was curious about how it would feel before I began. I wanted to find out, what would this do to me? How would it feel? Is this maybe something that's right for me, that's worth trying? But it's not like being a different person. You're still the same person. You're just, for me, it's just being in a much better mood pretty much all the time.
I'd like to send people to your website because I really want them to find out more about you and what you do. When you produce a video, when you do the work that you do, what's your focus? Is it based on issues related to sexuality? Is it about atheism or both?
I do cover a lot of different issues, and atheism is one of the central features. It's something I've covered extensively before, just the trouble that religion gets us all into and everything like that. I've also covered, LGBT issues of sexuality, issues of being transgender, things like that. And a lot of the time how that relates to religious morality is causing problems with that. And generally also politics and where religion tries to involve itself in politics, and generally just the ridiculous things that sometimes happen in the political sphere, current events from an atheistic and queer perspective, and basically anything else that comes to mind.
I have listeners all over the world, and there has to be a percentage of people who are struggling now with issues of identity, especially as it relates to sexuality. Do you have any words of encouragement for them?
I would say, whoever you are, it is okay. It is beautiful. It is not frightening. It is not bad. It is not wrong. Who you are is completely all right. And it is a shame that anyone has tried to stop you from embracing that part of who you are. If this is what it takes for you to be happy, then you should reach for that. You should fight for that. You deserve that. This is your one life. This is the one life we have. And you deserve to take hold of it. You deserve to make the most of it. You deserve to make it your own and be happy in it and never let anyone stop you.
I'm a fan. ZinniaJones.com to find out more. ZJ, thanks so much for spending a few minutes on the show. It's a tremendous pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let's go back to our Skype line. I've got Kitty on Skype. You're on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast. Thanks for calling.
Hi, Seth. It's the shaman's wife.
I'm so glad you called. How are you, young lady?
I am doing quite well, and yourself?
I'm doing well, despite the fact that I break into this sort of involuntary blush every 5 minutes on this show, for Pete's sake.
Are you paying attention to chat by any chance?
I'm trying not to. For those who are listening to the show after the fact, on Blog Talk Radio, there is a live chat experience that happens during every show. A few hundred people get in there, and over the course of 2 hours, about 700 people will stop by. And every time tonight I've looked into the chat room, I have looked away. I've just looked right back to the switchboard. I cannot take it. So what do you have for us tonight, young lady? What do you think?
Well, I was just thinking about it, and something caught my interest earlier when you were talking to Dr. Darrel Ray about it. It sort of sounded like a little bit about the BDSM lifestyle. And it's really, really interesting because there is just something about that lifestyle that can cause so many different emotions. And, of course, everybody who's religious thinks, oh, that's bad, that's naughty, that's icky. And it's not. It's really just a way to experience a different view of sex and bring yourself and your partner to an even greater sexual high.
Have you had to overcome any of these inhibitions? I mean, do you come from religion? Do you blush?
My parents,
am I the only one who hears this stuff and occasionally goes...
No, I still blush every now and then. It's very hard to make me blush now, but both of my parents and my stepmom were very religious. But sex in our household was, you talked about it, you knew what it was, done deal. However, to find out more of the various different stuff, I had to do a lot of research and I had to play around a lot. One of the things I got into early on when I was about 17, I got involved in a polyamorous relationship. And it included a, by the way, Dennis says you lost the game.
I got to explain that gag to everybody else now. Thank you very much. I'll explain it later, though. Keep going.
that relationship encompassed a lot of BDSM play where I was either tied up or my girlfriend at the time was tied up.
What does BDSM encompass? I mean, explain it for everybody who's listening.
There are a few different ways to explain it. It is bondage, discipline, sadomasochism is one of the acronyms that it stands for. Pretty much being tied up and having somebody take full control is pretty much what it is.
I have read, did I read it? Where many people in positions of authority and power, you'll find CEOs and people who are making big decisions who are always in control during the day. Part of their fantasy is to relinquish all control, to be dominated by someone. And a lot of this type of stuff, we'll see these big movers, shakers, their fantasy is to give it all up and have someone else command them. And that turns them on.
Yeah, it does. I'm actually one of those individuals because, like I said before on one of the other shows, I work in a situation where I have to tell people what to do all day long because I work internet tech support. So it's telling people what to do. When I get home, I don't want to be in control of anything. If anything, it's the shaman who's in control when I'm in the mood. And oh my God.
Do I really need to hear that? By the way, you call him the shaman. You two are both longtime listeners and you've called the show, and he is an actual shaman. And so we just call him that. It's just one of those things that he's sort of become this sort of mini celebrity. People on the chat room know him. People in the Facebook page know. They actually know you both. So as you say the shaman, you're talking about your other half, your significant other.
Yes.
And you were
my darling husband.
recently married as of last fall, as I recall.
Yes.
I have to resist the urge to call you Madam Kitty. I mean, it's like
No. I switch, but not that often.
Okay, all right. All right. Well, I appreciate the clarification there, Kat. And you say hi to your shaman man, all right?
Well.
Have a wonderful week. We'll see you later.
All righty.
All right. Bye. Let's see. I'm juggling so many windows here. I've got an email from Julia. Just had to share this story when I heard you were going to do a podcast with Darrel Ray. When I was still in the church and starting to question things, my husband and I were in a young married couple's Sunday school class. They decided to do a series of lessons on sex and marriage. Rather than the teacher lecture us for 45 minutes each Sunday, he brought in a video series by some Christian teacher for us to watch and discuss. I wish for the life of me I could remember the name of the teacher. The series was so laughable it couldn't have been taken seriously, but this 50-something-year-old preacher was in front of a crowd at a mega church talking to men in the audience about the importance of foreplay. The way he described foreplay was like climbing a palm tree to play with the coconuts. He even went into a Jamaican accent and said, "You climb on the palm trees and play with the coconuts." Julia, you got to be shitting. She continues, she says, "I nearly lost it in this class, but even some of the men in our young married couples class were nodding their heads like a light bulb had gone on inside." My husband pointed out that the video was childish and simplistic, stating any man who has had sex more than once would know that. It seemed to be a general consensus among the men and women in our class that sex was a gift from God to be enjoyed, but it seemed like women weren't interested in it. The church perpetuated that myth. Glad I'm not the only one who noticed that in that culture. Thank you for the validation, Julia. She continues, "I think the misogynistic and patriarchal views of Christianity in general create a paradigm that women don't like sex or that good girls don't think about it. And I think it's a disservice to marriage in general." How about relationships in general? She says, "I saw people getting divorced all the time in the church, and I think some of this was related to the church's skewed ideas on sex and sexuality. There were many women in my Sunday school class that didn't like sex or thought it was a chore. One of them was shocked to learn that my husband and I had gone to a sex toy store on a date. Needless to say, we left that Sunday school class and eventually dropped out of church altogether when I became an atheist, and he followed suit. Thanks for all you do, Seth. I love your show. Keep fighting for reason and logic." Julia, thank you so much for a great letter. It's funny, when I was in 6th grade, I was in Mrs. Keck's homeroom class, and they told us we had a special speaker coming in. and it was a class for boys only. And we found out that at the same time, they were doing a class with girls only. And of course, it was sex education. Now, I have no idea how schools handle sex education today. Do they still do the classes? Do they put it all on the parents? I don't know. I don't know what our public schools do, what they're allowed to do, what they're charged to do, what they're supposed to do, what parents want them to do. I don't know. But back then, they had us go into this classroom, all of us in the homeroom. We all went into this classroom, and one of the students' parents actually led the class, and he had a projector, which is what we did before we did. He had this overhead projector, which is what we did before laptops and PowerPoints. It's this big old clumsy overhead projector, and he had the transparent pieces of paper, and he'd slap them on there, and each one had a different graphic on it, and he would talk to us about the things that were happening to our bodies. After all, we were about to go through puberty. We're all like staring at the screen. Really? You see the diagram, you go, what's that? Well, that's going to look like you in a couple of years. And I don't really remember a whole lot about it was in 6th grade. It's all kind of a blur. But one thing he said, I do remember, and I remember it vividly. And I still to this day don't know what his motivation was for saying it. He said, don't you ever, ever go look up a diagram on women's bodies. And I think about that now, and I'm like, what would motivate him to say that? You got a bunch of freaking 6th grade boys in there, probably wildly curious and ashamed to admit it. And why would you say know as little about the female body as humanly possible? Was it a shame thing? Was he afraid we might? This is before the internet. So, he wasn't afraid we were going to Google it. And before you know it, you're looking at all sorts of stuff. And to this day, I look back and I think, why would he tell everybody, don't know? Or don't, maybe did he want us to wait a few years? Maybe it's more of a benign explanation. He wanted us to do it when we are more, emotionally and intellectually mature, when we'd grown up a little bit. But that one sentence sticks in my mind. Whatever you do, don't you ever look up a diagram of a woman's body. Of course, shame and the shame card is often played in the church. They say out loud that sex is a gift, right? It's a gift from God. In fact, many times they will tell you that many people defend the missionary position because you're looking each other in the eye. It's not just a physical experience. It is a spiritual experience. And I had a letter that falls along those lines. Greg said, I believe religion's almost utterly destroyed us as sexual beings. There have been so much guilt and finger-pointing from religious groups and leaders, it's nearly inescapable, even for atheists. Especially after having read Dr. Ray's Sex and God, I feel that we, all humans, have an enormous amount of work to do to reclaim that which may in fact be our greatest source of communication and healing, among other things, which is our sexuality. The religious claim that an unauthorized sex is evil and has done tremendous damage to our culture, while science is discovering at an impressive rate how powerful and healthy sex is for us. I hope we can find the truth sooner than later. Thankfully, the internet is here, and as you said, it's the place where we can be heard, while at the same time, it's where religion will die. If only that's true, my friend. Religion is like the t-shirt, the internet where religion goes to die. Before I move on, by the way, to my next guest, Kat said something. She said, hey, Seth, you lost the game. And I don't want to leave the rest of our listeners hanging. It's the ultimate inside joke. On the Facebook page, I saw somebody who said, hey, I lost the game. And of course, I have no idea what they're talking about. It's just called The Game. It's an abstract mental game. Millions of people are playing it at any time. The objective of the game is to avoid thinking about the game. Don't think about it. Play is continuous and never stops. You're either losing when you're thinking about the game, or you're not losing when you're not thinking about the game. Players who lose the game must tell other people they've lost the game. So essentially, you've got to block any idea of this game out of your mind. And the second you think about it, you've lost the game. And then you have to go tell somebody. You just walk up to them. I've lost the game. Of course, they ask you about it. And now they're thinking about the game. You lost the game. It's just one of those dumb things that really took off, and it became this running gag on the Facebook page. So now from time to time at random, somebody just pops in and just says, you lost the game. Jen Peoples is one of the co-hosts of the Atheists Experience, a very popular TV show that originates on public television in Austin, Texas, and via the internet has become hugely popular. And Jen Peoples has agreed to join me for a few minutes. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you. Happy to be here.
You have some strong opinions on this subject. I know that our theme tonight being atheism and sexuality. Let's start with the broader issue. Are atheists better largely in the sack? I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, I think if you look at generally being free of the kind of taboos that religious people have to deal with, I think in general that would lead to a better sex life. Especially fundamentalist Christians in particular, they have lots of rules surrounding sex. And I think if you want to have better sex, you should throw out the rules and just negotiate with the person you're in the sack with.
Well, I know that many take a position on it, and it's quite often the missionary position. It's very much a conservative. There are specific ways. If you do it this way, it is a perversion. It is not what God intended. There's a lot of that kind of thing within the church. You're military, right? Which branch?
I spent 26 years in the Army.
Thank you very much for your service, and I don't mean that in a cliche way, but I'm honestly a big fan of the men and women who serve in the armed forces, so thank you.
Thank you. I was happy to do it. I actually had a lot of fun most of the time.
Tell me about Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and your take on the whole, no one talk about it, let's ignore it, let's live around it. What's your perspective on that?
Well, as a lesbian who served on active duty as both a lesbian and an atheist, what I can tell you is that Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was the policy that was officially enacted in, I think it was 93 that was actually passed. That policy, as written, was the de facto policy, at least in the Army, even prior to that. And that policy, people think it was an attempt at allowing gay people to serve in the military. That's not true. That policy was developed by some fundamentalist Christians in the military working group in the Pentagon. This working group was chartered by the Clinton administration, and the original charter was figure out how we're going to basically eliminate the homosexual exclusion policy. Because up until that time, it was only a policy that Department of Defense had, and they said, hey, figure out how we, integrate gays into the military and allow open service. The military working group participants from the Army were fundamentalist Christians, and they made it their mission to make sure that gays did not serve in the military. They did it through a very well-crafted propaganda campaign, and it worked. And so what we ended up with was, instead of a policy that said you can't be gay in the military, we had an actual law passed by Congress that said you can't be gay and be in the military. So this Don't Ask, Don't Tell thing, it tried to make gay people invisible in the military. And so that's why I often say that Don't Ask, Don't Tell policies like that, whether you're talking about atheists or gay people or anything else, they serve the status quo. Their goal is to make bigots more comfortable by erasing the source of their discomfort.
What's the status of the policy on gays in the military right now?
It was repealed. And the repeal actually took effect, I'd have to go back and look. I think it was like September 2011, I think was when it was official.
So how were you treated by the other women in your, is it platoon or whatnot? Were you treated differently, or did everybody seem to get it?
You mean, was I treated differently for being gay?
Yeah.
The interesting thing is that, even though the official policy was Don't Ask, Don't Tell, it really wasn't fooling too many people. Basically, it allowed the command to ignore what they knew was the sexual orientation of certain people. And I guess because I was always regarded as a valuable asset to the unit, no one made a big deal about it. I think it was probably the elephant in the room that no one was talking about. And the interesting thing about women in the military, there have been several studies that kind of documented this. Women in the military tend to be much more open about serving with gay people, whether male or female, than men in the military do. And I think a big part of that is that women in the military kind of get that homophobia kind of has its origins in sexism. And women in the military have always understood that that anti-gay policy, it was used preferentially against women. And I can't even tell you how many young enlisted women I've talked to over the years that they were essentially raped by coercion. And by that, I mean they were approached by, some guy in their unit and said, hey, let's go out. And when they refused, a lot of these young women were told, hey, you either have sex with me or I'll tell everybody you're a lesbian and get you discharged. And it didn't matter if the woman was gay or straight. These guys knew how to target young women. And, if you're a young woman and you're one of a handful of women in a predominantly male unit, and the highest ranking woman is maybe an E5, a sergeant in the Army, and some guy approaches you like this, where are you going to turn? What are you going to do? If you go to your chain of command and complain, if this guy is senior enough in the chain of command, they may do whatever they can to protect him. And if you tell them that the guy threatened to say that you're gay, the next thing you know, you've got an investigation on you, and they're investigating whether you're gay.
One common thread I have seen with many of the people who send me correspondence is, I came out as gay to my religious family and it hit the fan. It was horrible. They told me I was in rebellion. They told me that it was the work of the devil. It was a perversion. It was all of these things. And I know you communicate quite often, and you communicate very well. And I want you, if you would, to communicate to anybody within the sound of my voice who might be going through those identity issues. They have been told by their cultures, by their churches, by society, for portions of society, that they are broken because they are not heterosexual. You have any words for them?
Yeah, you're not broken. There's nothing wrong with you. I was fortunate that when I came out to my family, it was over dinner, and it literally did not stop dinner conversation. They looked up and said, yeah, we know, and things continued as normal. And I really feel for people who, they experience this kind of rejection from family and friends. But what I can tell you is that I have this operational definition of family that goes something like, if you act like family, you are. And if you don't act like family, then you're not. And whether you share DNA with someone is irrelevant. So what I can tell people who come out to family and they are rejected by their biological family, there are so many people that will treat you so much better. You don't have to put up with that. And I know it hurts, and you'll feel whatever you feel for as long as you feel it, and just keep moving forward. That's all you can do. But do not let their religious baggage define you. Because if you try to put your sexuality back into a little box to preserve the status quo in your family, you will suffer for it.
Jen Peoples, one of the hosts of the Atheist Experience and a regular on Godless Bitches, which I'll have links to both of those in the description box of this. Thanks for taking a few minutes to talk to me on the issue, giving us your perspective, Jen. We're a big fan of what you do down there in Austin, Texas. And if there's anything we can do for you, just drop me a line, all right?
All right. Thank you very much.
You can just Google them if you want to find I was going to pull the website up, the Atheist Experience. I'm hoping to run into Matt and everybody down there in Austin, Texas during the 50-year anniversary National Convention for the American Atheists. That's coming up the final weekend in March 2013, and it's going to be huge. I'm so excited to be able to go down there and hang out with everybody. And if you're going to be there, do not get out of there without giving me a chance to meet you and shake your hand and just say thank you. I'm amazed at the family. It's funny. I had an email I posted early this morning about someone who was a teenager living at home, and it came to light that he was a non-believer, and it was horrible. I mean, it was near abusive, the response from his parents, or perhaps it was actually abusive, physically abusive, verbally abusive, and it was terrible. And I guess they kept him up half the night, telling him what a shame he was to the family and how he's going to drag them all to hell. I don't know where they get that from. Where's that in the Bible? His apostasy is going to condemn everybody else on the family tree? I don't think so. And they essentially played the emotional blackmail card. And he wanted me to sort of communicate to everybody else the difficulties of coming out and why some people do not go public with their non-belief. Perhaps many of the same reasons many people do not go public with their sexual orientation. because the consequences are crazy. I mean, everybody's situation is extremely complicated. It's very different. And I don't call anybody a coward who plays those cards close to the vest for a while. Sometimes you really do have to take your time. But the reminder is that family does come in many forms. Jen said it well. I mean, whether you're on the immediate family tree or not is not the biggest question. The biggest question is, do you act like family? Do you share love? Do you give support? Do you do what families do? And many people come to the Thinking Atheist community and communities like it to get that sense of family. In many cases, the family they may have lost because they have been rejected over what they believe. The thought of it makes me livid. Parents who tell their children, think like me and act like me or I won't love you. It makes your blood boil to think about it. I said it in the book. You're not raising a child, you're replicating. You want an imprint, a rubber stamp. That's what you want. Think like me, believe like me, worship my God, have my political points of view, do it like I do it, or else. And for those people who come to a moment of critical mass in their own families and feel like they have nothing, well, you don't have nothing. You have something. You have us. We got to stick together, okay? 410. You're on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast. Who's this?
Hey, Seth, this is David. How are you today?
I'm doing well. David, the subject today is atheism and sexuality. What do you think? What's your opinion on all this?
Well, I'm 17 years old. I'm gay, and I grew up in a Christian household and still do go to church and all. And one of the things that I have noticed in the Christian faith and within other people who are homophobic or whatever, that the people who hate gays end up being gay. I do know several people who were staunch against homosexuality and then turned out to be gay. I was one of them. And another thing that I have noticed when reading the Bible or whatever is that God appears to be more concerned about what people do in bed than the poor people or the evil that's going on around us. To me, I just don't fully understand why God cares more about where people stick their own dick than the evil and the violence that's going on all around us.
I did a speech at the Oklahoma Free Thought Convention where I spoke about God's alarming obsession with the penis. And it is a valid question when you think about all the horrible, heinous things happening on the planet, war and disease, and you think this guy's obsessed with what's between your legs. It's a little bit odd, don't you think?
Exactly. Especially what happened recently with Sandy Hook and the Aurora shootings and all. I always want to ask the fundamentalist questions, where was God during all of that? If God is all loving and all powerful, why didn't he intervene to save the lives of those 20-plus children?
Well, many of them are going to blame you. They're going to say it's because we allowed homosexuality. It's because we allowed the proliferation of abortion clinics. It's because we have become a godless culture, and therefore his hand of protection has been removed. And that's kind of a knee-jerk response, right? So you're in a Christian home. I'm guessing you're surrounded by religious people. How are you doing? Yeah. Are you ostracized? They give you a hard time? How's that journey going?
It's going well. I became an atheist around my freshman year in high school, and I couldn't be happier. It's definitely led to the huge burden of shoulders off of me, thinking, oh my God, I'm gay, I'm going to be burning in hell for all of eternity. And then slowly coming to the realization that it's infinitely times more likely that the Bible's just false. My parents love me, I love my parents. We have our disagreements at times, but we definitely have great respect for each other, and we do love each other. So
good for them. Good for them. And honestly, kudos to them for seeing past the differences that you might have and embracing you and loving you for who you are. I think that's fantastic. I do appreciate your call and your participation in the show today, and all my best for you for the new year, okay?
All right, thank you, and have a great day.
I saw a terrific article on ABC News about the love monkey. Now, hang on. Just stay with me for a second. Scientists continue to be amazed by the sexual antics of the bonobo monkey. I hope I'm saying it right. B-O-N-O-B-O. The bonobos. All right, they share more than 98% of the same DNA as their human cousins, and they party like rock stars. They are the free sex hippies of the animal world, says primatologist Franz de Waal of Emory University in Atlanta, author of Bonobo, The Forgotten Ape. These monkeys get it on like monkeys. When it comes to making love, real chimps don't monkey around. It's all business with rarely any foreplay. A typical lovemaking session lasts under 10 seconds. The bonobos, however, are connoisseurs of recreational nookie. I'm reading from the ABC article. If two males get into a fight over food, they'll do a little more, then kiss and make up. Quote, they practice homosexuality much more than other species, and they do it just for pleasure, says de Waal. Now, there are many people who say that homosexuality is a perversion. It is because we as human beings have rejected God, and we have embraced the devil and all these horrible things, and that homosexuality does not exist in the animal kingdom. And I always send them links to this video. Hello? It happens everywhere. Bonobo, Bonobos. You got to go YouTube that sucker as soon as you can. It's fascinating. My next guest, Greta Christina, she's been writing professionally since the late 80s, and she talks about a lot of stuff. Atheism, sexuality, LGBT stuff, just pop culture stuff, or just the culture. I don't know if it's pop culture. And she was kind enough to agree to be on the show today. Greta Christina, so glad you're here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
I must say that Why Are You Atheists So Angry is something I've passed on several occasions onto my page users, because I think it encapsulates what many people are so frustrated about, and it helps to counter the argument that many believers use to marginalize us, right? Y'all are just angry, you're malcontents, you're just rudderless rage people. And I thought you did a great job of articulating, we have a legitimate gripe.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, that is one of the things that I felt so strongly about that book is when people say, oh, why are you so angry? There's something wrong with you for being angry. I don't want to respond by saying, oh, no, we're not angry. Of course, we're just nice, calm, happy people. Of course, many of us are, in fact, happy people with good lives. But to respond to that accusation by saying, no, we're not angry, buys into the assumption that there's something wrong with us if we are angry. And, a lot of us are angry about religion, and we have a right to be.
The theme of the show being atheism and sexuality. It's funny because we had talked, in fact, I spoke to Zinnia Jones just a few minutes ago about the parallels between coming out as a non-heterosexual, right, not fitting into the biblical cookie cutter of sexuality, and coming out as an atheist. And there are many parallels.
There's definitely a lot of parallels. And in fact, I think that the atheist movement in many ways has been modeling itself after the LGBT movement, which I think is a smart thing to do. I mean, it's not exact parallels. There's some important differences, but I think that there's a lot of parallels. And certainly, when you talk with people who are both queer and who are atheist, including myself, a lot of us are very conscious of the parallels and of the similarities. And in fact, a lot of people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, and who are also atheist, a lot of them say that it's easier to come out as LGBT than it is to come out as atheist. And I think a lot of that is because, the LGBT community they're kind of ahead of the game. I guess I should say are ahead of the game. We've been doing very public, very visible, very vocal activism, since the 60s. And, to some extent, even since before that. And, the atheist movement has been certainly doing activism for many, many, many decades, centuries even. But we haven't really been super visible, vocal, active, organized. It's only been for a few years. And so we haven't been able to lay the groundwork as much as the LGBT community has for acceptance and recognition and overturning myths about us and so on. And so I do think in some ways it's more difficult, at least in the United States, to come out as atheist than it is to come out as gay, because there's just more history and more groundwork has been laid by the gay movement.
I have a question about a term that you just used, and I heard Zinnia use it as well. Now, I'm a recent apostate as of about 4 or 5 years ago, and obviously my horizons have broadened on sexual issues in a great way since I stepped out of that Bible cookie cutter, out of the Bible rules and regulations for what healthy sexuality is. The word queer, where I'm at here in Oklahoma, it's considered insulting, it's considered a derogatory term, or do I have that wrong?
It's complicated. The short answer is it's complicated. A somewhat longer answer is that it's a word that is insulting that LGBT people are reclaiming. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's, of course, a long history. A lot of marginalized groups have a history of reclaiming words that have been used against them that are insulting as a way of sort of gaining power over the word. So there's that history. And also there's a history of liking to use the word queer because otherwise you can have this alphabet soup situation. It's like if you're trying to talk about people who are lesbian, people who are gay men, people who are bisexual, people who are transgendered, transvestite, intersex people who are questioning their sexuality, that's a kind of a large group of people. And historically, the gay community has tended to be, has a history of being a little bit sexist, has a history of not being very inclusive of bisexual people, hasn't always been great with transgendered rights. And so the word queer kind of got used to include all of us, to say, look, this is all of us together. We're all in the same fight. We're all in the same community. We're all in the same movement, as opposed to just saying gay, which lesbians didn't necessarily feel included by that. Bisexuals didn't feel included by that. Trans people didn't feel included by that. Intersex people didn't feel included by that. So the word queer kind of got used as a shorthand, like as an umbrella term. And now the more common term for that is LGBT. For people who are outside the community to use the word, my advice would be...
Yeah, you won't probably hear that word come out of my mouth in any... it just feels like a loaded word unless you are sort of intimate with the culture. So I don't know.
And I think that's actually a good instinct is, to some extent that's changing. There are, for instance, colleges and universities that have queer studies programs. And, once you have a queer studies program, to some extent the word is on the table. It's, legitimized. But I think if your feeling is that you're not comfortable with the word, that you feel it as an insult, and it is, I think, still a little bit loaded for people outside the community, which is often the case for language that's reclaimed. I have lots of straight friends and allies who do use the word, but if you're not comfortable with it and you feel like you don't understand the nuances, I think that's a good instinct to listen to.
Talking here with Greta Christina, let me speak to the first of the two blog articles I'd found on this by you, A Skeptic's View of Sexual Transcendence. The lead sentence in the article says this. It says, for some reason, the sex-positive community is also very often a spiritual community. And then in the blog, you refer to attitudes and practices of sexuality that are commonly linked to everything from spiritual, this, new age, that, astrology and chi and the metaphysical. And there are many people who believe that if you approach the issue of sexuality without spirituality, you're sort of cheating yourself. You're missing out on the full experience. And you argue against that, right?
Definitely. I mean, obviously, I argue against that. The main reason I argue against that is I think that spirituality is... what's the word I'm looking for? Bunk.
Yeah, that's pretty good word.
But say you're missing out on something because you're missing out on this area of experience that I think is non-existent and entirely made up. That's kind of absurd. So yes, I do think that a lot of the reason driving that kind of thinking is that we've grown up in a culture that thinks that to be religious means to be good. To be spiritual means to be good. It equates spirituality and virtue. And so when for sex positive people who haven't let go of religion or spirituality, when they do start to reclaim sexuality and see sexuality as a positive thing, rather than rejecting religion, what they try to do is incorporate religion into the sexuality, because the way that they frame their sexuality as good is to see it as religious or spiritual. But I think that that's ridiculous. I think it's not necessary. And in fact, to me, the idea that our experience is just material, that we are material beings, we are life forms that evolved from other life forms that came about due to this biochemical reactions from rocks and water and sunlight. The idea that life came to being out of non-life as a physical process, and that consciousness came to being as a physical process, and that then not just consciousness, but this shared consciousness, this ecstatic and joyful shared consciousness that can happen with the experience of sex. To me, that idea that's not depressing. That's really magnificent. That's really exciting. The idea that, 4 billion years ago, all there was this rocks and water and sunlight. And out of that, we developed this capacity to be aware of ourselves and aware of each other and to give ourselves and each other joy. That's magnificent. That's just wonderful to me. And the idea that you have to believe in non-existent entities and non-existent substances for your experience of sexuality to be positive and to be valid, to me, this is kind of baffling, and it's a little bit sad. It's like it's as if it's like saying you can't enjoy Christmas if you don't believe in Santa Claus. I don't believe in Santa Claus anymore. I used to believe in Santa Claus. I don't anymore. I still have a great time at Christmas. I give my friends presents. I give my family presents. We eat a lot, and it's a wonderful, joyful, meaningful experience. And I don't have to pretend in something that doesn't exist in order for that to be really meaningful and valuable.
In the blog article called Tantric Orgasms and Sacred Sex, New Age Spirituality in the Sex Community. By the way, kudos for a title that makes you read the rest of the piece. I was like, I got to read this. You actually, and forgive me if I do you an injustice here, so correct me if I get it wrong, but you're saying that even on a physical level, you can almost emulate the spiritual experience with healthy sexuality. You can actually emulate that. You call it an almost telepathic connection with another person. Did I get that right?
Well, I wouldn't call it emulating a spiritual experience exactly, although that's close. What I would say is that some of the experiences that some spiritual or religious believers describe as religious or spiritual, I think they're not, obviously. I don't think, because I don't think the supernatural exists. But what I think is that religious believers are misinterpreting those experiences. I do think that it can happen in sex that you can feel very intensely and intimately connected with another person in a way that, if you don't have a good materialist framework for it, can seem as if it's telepathy. Our souls are communicating. And, really what's happening is you're still both physical beings, but you're communicating and connecting just very profoundly and very intimately and very intensely. And it's not so much that I think that we're emulating what spiritual experiences of sexuality, as and this is going to come out somewhat harsh, but that I think that spiritual believers are misunderstanding what's going on.
You're saying we simply correctly interpret what is happening naturally.
Exactly. It's a natural experience, it's a physical experience. But again, I think that in our culture, the usual framework we have for very ecstatic, very intense, very joyful experiences is a framework of spirituality. And obviously, I think that that's mistaken, but there's such a reflex for people to call that spiritual. And I think that that's something that atheists and materialists, we need to talk about more. We need to talk more about, we can have experiences of joy without framing it as spiritual. It doesn't mean anything about the supernatural. It just, this is what our brains do. Our brains are wired to have these joyful experiences. And I don't think that minimizes it. I actually think that it makes it more magnificent.
Allow me, if I may, to quote just a paragraph from A Skeptic's View of Sexual Transcendence. You say, quote, "To me, the idea that out of nothing but earth and water and sunlight, these wildly complex living beings have developed not only with the capacity for consciousness, but with the capacity to create the experience of ecstasy for ourselves and one another. And that is just jaw-droppingly astonishing. We can create the experience of joy, of deep, expansive pleasure that takes us out of ourselves and into one another, and we do it through a complex rearrangement of the energy of the sun and the atoms and molecules of the planet. That is magnificent. That, more than any spiritual belief I ever had, makes me feel both humble and proud. That makes me feel intimately connected with the rest of the universe in a way that no spiritual practice ever did. What's that old hippie song about how we're stardust made of billion-year-old carbon? You don't have to believe in metaphysical energy to think that is wicked cool." Very, very well said, Greta.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks. That's really is one of my very favorite pieces, and it's something that seems to have struck a chord with a lot of people. I actually do a lot of public speaking. I speak at colleges and universities and conferences and so on. And one of the talks that I give most often, especially at colleges and universities, unsurprisingly, it's very popular, is the Atheism and Sexuality talk. And when I talk about that sense of magnificence and awe in the fact that we are physical beings, that's something that a lot of people really respond to.
We found the same was the case when speaking of death and not having an afterlife, right? The argument is, well, if there's no heaven, why bother living? If there's no kingdom in the sky, then we're just marking time. And of course, we take the reverse angle. This is a magical thing that we are here, and it's every moment should be cherished. It actually, the opposite of the religious argument is true. We cherish it because it is temporary.
Exactly. It's like the fact that this is all there is. If this life is all that we have, then it's almost like a moral obligation to really celebrate it and to really treasure it and to really revel in it. And also, to try to make life better for other people. If there's other people in the world and this is their only life, this is all they've got, then I think that gives us a moral obligation to try to make that life better. And that can mean, in sort of the obvious senses of doing, charitable work, doing social justice work, trying to do political change and so on. But it also just means giving joy to your friends and your lovers and your spouses, and whether that's sexual or not. The fact that this life is all we have, that doesn't diminish that life. That makes it that much more important.
Greta Christina, tell me exactly, what is the Godless Perverts Story Hour?
Okay, so the Godless Perverts Story Hour is an event that I've been co-organizing with David Fitzgerald and Chris Hall. Chris Hall is actually one who came up with the name Godless Perverts. And what it is it's I guess you could call it a literary event. It's an event where atheist writers, atheist sex writers, come together to read writings that they've done about sex and sexuality. And that's included, erotic writing, erotic fiction, political writing, memoirs, personal reminiscences, and so on. And essentially how we came up with this idea is we were talking about the fact that you have to do atheist community organizing differently in different parts of the country and different parts of the world. What people want and need in Kansas is different from what people want and need in Austin, Texas, and is different from what people want and need in San Francisco. And we were talking about, what can we do to get an atheist community excited and interested in coming out to events in San Francisco? Well, it's San Francisco. The obvious answer is sex. And so we decided, let's pull together this really good atheist sex writers here in the Bay Area. Let's do an event. And people could come out and listen to readings, and we're going to make it more sort of fun. It's not like so much academic explorations of research about sexuality, and so it's more personal, more erotic, more sexy, and so on. And it was a huge hit. The first one we did was a big hit. This is something we've just started doing. We did our first one at the end of 2012. We haven't even scheduled our next one. We're going to be scheduling our next one soon in the spring, and in fact, we're going to be doing one at the Reason Fest conference in Kansas coming up in April. And, basically it's our view is that, again, the atheist views and non-religious views of sex and sexuality are in most ways far better, far more attractive than views of sex and sexuality of most religions. And that's a big draw to atheism, and it's also something that can really bring atheists together. Now, what is it? Is it? Are we all sitting in a room and there's a live reading? That's exactly what it is. It's basically just like, people coming up and doing readings or, readings, spoken word performances, and so on. Some people, I tend to just read from a piece of paper because I can't memorize anything to save my life. Other people are doing more kind of, extemporizing storytelling and so on. But yeah, so it's basically just people sitting and listening to people do readings and performances about having to do with sex and having to do with the intersection of sex and atheism or sex and religion. And some of it was things that were very critical of religion or mocking of religion or questioning of, religious views of sexuality. There was one person who did a piece about trying to have a sexual relationship with a religious person as an atheist. And then also people spoke about atheist and materialist views of sexuality. I read the Skeptic's view of sexual transcendence piece. And it was just such a wonderful event. And, I'm hoping that this is something that we're going to continue doing and that we're going to do at conferences and so on. I will be at the Reason Fest event in Kansas, and I guarantee you, if anything on the agenda says Godless Pervert Story Hour, you just might as well just bring in some extra chairs. You might as well just prepare yourself, because I have a feeling it's going to be well attended. It honestly sounds like a lot of fun and a great idea. Thanks so much. I definitely hope so. I think it's the first one we did in San Francisco was a big hit, and so I'm very much hoping that this is going to take off. By the way, details on Reason Fest, and you will also be at the 50-year National Convention for the American Atheist in late March. I do have links for those on the homepage at thethinkingatheist.com. For your time and for your insight, Greta Christina, thank you so much for taking a few minutes. It has been a real pleasure. Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you so much for having me. We'll finish the show with an email from Josh,
who is emailing from Australia. He says, on the subject of sex, we Aussies always get a laugh when an American states, hey, I'll be rooting for you, or I root for this team or that. In Australian, rooting is slang for having sex. As in, I met this girl down at the pub and we went back to my place and spent the night rooting like rabbits. So by all means, keep rooting for us as often as possible. I don't know that I'll ever be able to say the word again, Josh. Jeez. Thanks so much to everybody for listening and being a part of the show. Coming up next week, we're going to be talking to David Silverman, president of the American Atheists. Coming up the week after that, it's Producers Workshop. And if you have a suggestion for a radio podcast, you can drop me an email, podcast@thethinkingatheist.com. Have a wonderful week. Thank you so much for listening. And by the way, you lost the game. See ya.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter. Watch dozens of original videos on the Thinking Atheist YouTube channel. And visit our website for resources, links, contact information, the editor's blog, and more. thethinkingatheist.com.